The psychiatric hospital stood like a forgotten relic on the outskirts of the city, its towering walls casting long shadows over the unkempt grounds. Built in the late 19th century, it had once been a symbol of hope and progress, a place where the mentally ill could find sanctuary and care. But over the decades, it had decayed, its halls haunted by whispers of malpractice, disappearances, and something darker that no one could name. To the world outside, it was simply Marston Psychiatric Hospital, but to those within its grasp, it was a prison of uncertainty and dread. Alex Harper adjusted his tie in the cracked rearview mirror of his car, the journalist's notebook sitting like a heavy weight in his lap. His editor had called the assignment a puff piece. Investigate the rumors surrounding the hospital, write a gripping exposé, and move on to something real. But Alex wasn't here for rumors. Something about the hospital gnawed at him, a primal sense of unease he couldn't shake. He'd read the articles, the conspiracy blogs, and the personal accounts of former patients, each painting a picture more sinister than the last. Missing patients, unexplained deaths, and staff turnover so frequent it defied explanation. Alex had pitched the idea of going undercover, and against all odds, his editor had agreed. Remember, he muttered to himself as he grabbed his pre-packed duffel bag, "You're not a journalist here. You're a patient." The plan was simple. Check in under a false identity, observe, and gather evidence. Alex had chosen to feign symptoms of paranoia, hallucinations, delusions of persecution, and anxiety. Common enough to be credible, vague enough to avoid close scrutiny. As he stepped through the wrought iron gates, a chill ran down his spine, and he realized he had already begun questioning whether this assignment was worth it. Inside, the air was stifling, thick with a sterile chemical tang that clung to the back of his throat. The reception area was dimly lit, with peeling wallpaper and a flickering fluorescent bulb overhead. Behind the desk, a nurse in a starched white uniform barely glanced at him as he approached. "Name?" she asked, her voice devoid of interest. "Alex," he caught himself. Daniel Grayson," he said, giving the alias he'd rehearsed. "I have an appointment." The nurse raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as she flipped through a dog-eared ledger. After what felt like an eternity, she nodded and gestured toward a narrow hallway. "Dr. Carr will see you now. Down the hall, second door on the right." She didn't look up again. The hallway was suffocating, its walls closing in with every step Alex took. The faint scent of antiseptic mingled with something mustier, older. His heart raced as he reached the door, its chipped paint revealing layers of history beneath. The brass nameplate read Dr. Evelyn Carr in engraved letters. Gathering his courage, he knocked, and a soft, measured voice invited him inside. Dr. Carr was younger than he had expected, her sharp features framed by dark, perfectly styled hair. She looked up from a thick file and offered a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Grayson," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "Why don't you tell me what brings you here?" Alex hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it, the line between his true self and the character he had created. I don't feel safe," he began, his voice faltering. "There are people following me, watching me. I hear them at night, whispering through the walls." Dr. Carr nodded, her pen moving swiftly across the page. "And these feelings of being watched, when did they start?" He gave the answer he'd prepared. "A few months ago. It's getting worse. I can't sleep. Sometimes I see shadows that shouldn't be there." "I know it sounds crazy." "Not at all," she said, her tone practiced. "You're in the right place, Mr. Grayson. We'll take good care of you." Her words were meant to reassure, but Alex couldn't ignore the fleeting glint in her eyes, a mixture of curiosity and something darker, more calculating. By the time the session ended, Alex felt drained, his confidence shaken. Dr. Carr's questions had been probing, her demeanor too perceptive. Had she seen through his facade? As he was led to his assigned room, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed into dangerous territory. The door closed behind him with a resounding click, locking him in a sterile, windowless room with a narrow bed and a single chair. He sat on the edge of the mattress, the silence pressing in on him. As night fell, Alex lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The air felt heavier now, the shadows in the corners of the room deeper and more menacing. He told himself it was just his imagination, the stress of the day playing tricks on his mind. But then he heard it, a faint whisper just outside his door. It wasn't a word, just a sound, soft and insidious. He sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. The whisper grew louder, joined by others, like a chorus of voices echoing through the walls. Alex's breath caught in his throat as the realization dawned on him. The rumors were true. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with Marston Psychiatric Hospital, and he had just checked in. The whispers began again in the early hours, faint and distant, as if carried on a breeze that didn't exist. Alex lay motionless on the stiff mattress, his ears straining to catch every sound. The voices were low and indistinct, their cadence unnatural, as though they were speaking in a language not meant for human ears. Occasionally, one voice would rise above the others, louder, insistent, before dissolving back into the murmuring cacophony. It wasn't just the voices, it was the unsettling intent behind them. They weren't random noises. They were purposeful, directed, and somehow aware. Morning brought no reprieve. Alex emerged from his room, feeling groggy and disoriented, the dull fluorescent lights of the hospital's common area burning his eyes. The space was sparsely furnished, with mismatched chairs and tables scattered haphazardly across a scuffed linoleum floor. Patients milled about, some staring blankly at walls, others muttering to themselves. Alex forced himself to blend in, sitting in a corner with his notebook hidden in his lap. His cover was critical, and the whispers were something he needed to investigate discreetly. He hadn't been sitting long when a wiry man with darting eyes shuffled over to him. "New guy," the man said, his voice low and raspy. He leaned in conspiratorially. "You hear them yet?" Alex stiffened, but managed to keep his composure. "Hear what?" "The voices." The man's eyes widened, and he glanced around nervously. "They come at night, through the walls. Some of us think it's the staff, but it's not. It's them." Alex's journalistic instincts kicked in, but he chose his words carefully. "Who's them?" The man leaned in even closer, his breath hot and sour. "The ones who never leave. They're trapped here, like us. Maybe worse than us." He paused, his gaze shifting to the far corner of the room. "They don't like it when we talk about them." Alex followed his gaze, but saw nothing unusual, just a shadowed corner where the overhead light failed to reach. When he turned back, the man was gone, retreating to the other side of the room as if nothing had happened. Alex jotted down the interaction in his notebook, his mind racing. The man's paranoia could be explained away by his condition, but Alex couldn't ignore the chill that had settled in his chest. Later that day, Alex found himself in the cafeteria, its cold metal tables and plastic trays an extension of the hospital's sterile, lifeless atmosphere. He noticed a group of patients sitting together, their heads bent in hushed conversation. They seemed alert, their eyes darting toward the staff and the walls as they spoke. Alex approached cautiously, his curiosity outweighing his fear. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, gesturing to an empty chair. The group exchanged wary glances before one of them, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, nodded. "You're new here," she said matter-of-factly. "You'll learn soon enough." "Learn what?" Alex pressed, keeping his tone casual. The woman sighed, her hands trembling slightly as she pushed her tray aside. "This place, it isn't what they say it is. It's not just for treatment. They're hiding something, and the voices, they're part of it." Another patient, a younger man with scars crisscrossing his arms, chimed in. "They try to tell us things, warnings maybe, or secrets, but the staff won't let us listen. They know." Alex frowned. "The staff knows about the voices?" The woman nodded. "Of course they do. Why do you think they keep us so drugged up? They don't want us to hear too much. And when someone does," she trailed off, her expression darkening. "They disappear." "Disappear?" Alex's voice dropped to a whisper. "What do you mean?" "Exactly what it sounds like," she said, her voice trembling. "One day they're here, the next day they're gone. No explanation, no goodbyes. Just gone." The conversation was interrupted by the sharp clang of a metal tray hitting the floor. Alex turned to see an orderly standing by the doorway, his eyes fixed on the group. The patients immediately fell silent, their gazes dropping to the table. Alex felt a surge of adrenaline as the orderly's piercing stare landed on him, his expression unreadable but undeniably suspicious. That night, Alex lay awake again, listening. The whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. He pressed his ear to the cold wall, trying to decipher the words, but they slipped through his comprehension like water through a sieve. Just as he was about to give up, a single phrase broke through the static, clear and chilling. "Help us." Alex jerked back, his heart pounding. He stared at the wall, his breath shallow, his mind racing. The voices weren't just sounds. They were pleading, desperate, and he was beginning to suspect that the true horror of Marston Psychiatric Hospital wasn't in the patients' minds, but in the walls themselves. The next morning, Alex woke to the sound of his door unlocking, the metallic scrape cutting through the silence. An orderly entered without knocking, a burly man whose expression was as flat and unfeeling as the linoleum beneath their feet. "Breakfast," the orderly grunted, nodding toward the common area. Alex sat up, blinking away the haze of another restless night. The whispers from the walls still echoed faintly in his mind, their plea, "Help us," clinging to him like a second skin. In the cafeteria, the atmosphere was different. The patients were subdued, their conversations replaced by the scrape of forks on plastic trays. Alex scanned the room, his eyes lingering on the group he'd spoken to the day before. The middle-aged woman, with trembling hands, was missing. The others avoided his gaze, their faces tight with unease. "Where's the woman from yesterday?" Alex whispered to the scarred young man, who flinched at the question. "Don't ask," the man muttered, his voice barely audible. "They'll hear you." Before Alex could press further, Dr. Carr entered the room, her presence commanding. She glided between tables, exchanging pleasantries with patients who responded robotically, their words devoid of life. When she reached Alex, her sharp eyes swept over him like a scalpel. "Daniel," she said, her tone warm but calculated. "How are you settling in?" Alex forced a smile. "Fine, I guess. Still trying to adjust." "Good," she said, nodding. "Routine is important here. Consistency helps the mind heal." Her gaze lingered for a moment too long before she moved on, leaving Alex with the unsettling impression that she saw more than he wanted her to. After breakfast, Alex was escorted to a group therapy session. The room was small, its walls lined with outdated motivational posters. Their cheerful slogans faded with time. The patients sat in a circle, their postures slumped, their eyes distant. Dr. Carr sat at the head of the group, her clipboard balanced on her lap. "We're going to talk about progress today," she began, her tone gentle yet firm. "Who would like to start?" One by one, the patients shared stories that felt rehearsed, their words hollow. Alex listened, his unease growing with each passing moment. When it was his turn, he hesitated. I've been hearing things," he said carefully, watching Dr. Carr's reaction. "Voices, I think." At night, the room fell silent. The other patients shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to Dr. Carr, who remained composed. "It's not uncommon," she said, her pen poised over her clipboard. "Many of our patients experience auditory hallucinations. It's a symptom of stress, trauma, or chemical imbalances. It doesn't feel like a hallucination," Alex said, his voice firmer now. "It feels real, and I'm not the only one who's heard them." Dr. Carr's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. Delusions can be contagious in environments like this. That's why it's important to focus on your own recovery, Daniel. Alex knew he'd pushed too far. He nodded, feigning agreement, but inside his resolve solidified. The voices were real. He had no doubt about that now. That night, Alex stayed awake, his ear pressed against the cold wall. The whispers came again, louder, more urgent. This time he was prepared. He whispered back, "Who are you?" The voices hesitated, a moment of static-filled silence before a single word emerged. "Trapped." Alex's pulse quickened. "How can I help you?" The response was immediate, overlapping voices speaking in fractured unison. "Find us." Beneath, His mind raced as he tried to make sense of the cryptic message. Beneath? Beneath what? The hospital? The room? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, unnatural creak. He turned, his heart pounding, to see a shadow moving across his room. It wasn't cast by anything he could see, and yet it slithered along the wall, expanding and contracting like a living thing. Frozen in place, Alex watched as the shadow coalesced into a shape, a humanoid figure, tall and impossibly thin, its edges rippling like smoke. Its hollow eyes seemed to lock onto him, and for the first time, Alex felt the full weight of the hospital's malevolence. He backed away slowly, his breath caught in his throat. The shadow didn't follow, but its presence lingered, an oppressive weight that pressed down on his chest. When he finally managed to blink, the figure was gone. But Alex knew better. The shadows in Marston Psychiatric Hospital weren't just tricks of the light. They were alive, and they were watching. The days blurred together for Alex as he became increasingly absorbed in the strange occurrences around him. Each night, the whispers returned, always with the same desperate plea, "Help us." Beneath, the more he listened, the more the voices seemed to sharpen, as though they were growing in strength, urgency, and clarity. They weren't the only things growing, however. Alex's own sense of paranoia was expanding with them, feeding off the anxiety that seemed to pervade the very air in Marston Psychiatric Hospital. Every moment felt charged with an unseen force, a constant presence just beyond his reach. Even the staff, usually so detached and professional, carried an unspoken tension in their movements. Dr. Carr, in particular, seemed to be watching him more closely, her gaze sometimes lingering on him a little too long during their encounters. Alex couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than she let on, that she was part of whatever dark undercurrent ran through the institution. But despite this growing discomfort, Alex remained determined. He had to uncover the truth. His only lead was the cryptic message from the voices. Beneath. What did it mean? Beneath the building? Beneath the layers of madness and control? Alex couldn't be sure, but he was starting to feel that the hospital itself held more secrets than its sterile walls let on. It wasn't until a few days later, during an unexpected trip to the hospital's library, that Alex began to understand how far this mystery ran. He had been granted permission to do some research as part of his ongoing therapy, a chance to engage in a more productive activity. Alex didn't care for therapy, but the library provided an opportunity to dig deeper into the hospital's history. Perhaps there were clues hidden in the past that could shed light on the present. The library was a small, dimly lit room tucked away in a forgotten corner of the facility. It was filled with old books, their spines cracked and yellowed, and shelves so tightly packed that they seemed to groan under the weight of forgotten knowledge. Alex was drawn to a section of medical journals, some dating back to the early 20th century. As he scanned the shelves, something caught his eye, an old leather-bound folder tucked away behind a row of more modern publications. Curious, Alex pulled it out and opened it carefully. The folder contained documents from the hospital's early years, and at first, they seemed innocuous. Staff rosters, patient records, and administrative paperwork. But as he flipped through the pages, a peculiar pattern emerged. There were multiple references to a restricted area, one that had been sealed off during the hospital's construction in the late 1800s. The area, according to the records, was marked as unsafe for general occupancy and was kept under strict supervision. The documents didn't explain why it was unsafe, only that it had been deemed necessary to the hospital's security and integrity. The further Alex dug, the stranger the records became. In the margins of several pages, someone had scrawled cryptic notes. Do not trust the walls. The corridor is not closed. They are watching from below. These notes seem to have been added long after the documents were originally filed, as though someone still within the hospital had been adding these warnings over the years. Alex's pulse quickened as he continued reading, piecing together a disturbing narrative. According to the files, the sealed-off area was located beneath the hospital, below the main structure. There were few records on what it contained, but the words experiments and containment appeared more than once. Alex's heart began to race. This hidden area, this beneath, could be the key to everything: the voices, the shadows, the patient's strange behavior. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, sharp and deliberate. Alex quickly stuffed the folder back into place, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't supposed to be in the library alone. The staff monitored the patients closely, and this kind of unsupervised research wasn't part of the therapeutic activities they approved. Alex knew he had to leave before anyone noticed him. As he slipped out of the library and made his way back to his room, his mind raced. The restricted area beneath the hospital. He had to find it, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized how dangerous this pursuit could be. Who was controlling the flow of information in this place? Who was keeping these secrets, and why? That night, as Alex lay in his bed, the whispers returned, more intense than ever. He pressed his ear to the wall, and this time, the voices weren't just desperate. They were frantic. "Hurry," they urged. "They know. You have to find it before it's too late." Alex's resolve hardened. He couldn't back down now. Whatever was hidden beneath Marston Psychiatric Hospital had to be uncovered, no matter the cost. The next day, Alex's thoughts were consumed with the records he had uncovered. The more he reflected on the cryptic notes in the margins, "The corridor is not closed. Do not trust the walls," the more convinced he became that the key to everything lay beneath the hospital. His mind, however, struggled with the implications. If there was indeed something hidden under the building, it was more than just a space or an abandoned section. There was a reason it had been sealed off, a reason that no one talked about it. But what was it? And why did the voices seem to know so much about it? Alex knew he had to find the entrance. The voices had been more urgent that night, a collective plea rising in pitch, as if time was running out. The hospital had become more than just a place of confinement for the patients. It was a maze filled with secrets, and Alex felt like the walls themselves were closing in on him. The more he moved through its hallways, the more the sensation of being watched consumed him. His skin prickled at the thought that the hospital itself might be alive, its oppressive presence never far, always lurking just beneath the surface of his perception. He spent the morning in a haze, moving between mandatory activities and therapy sessions with an absent mind. His attempts to connect with the other patients had proven fruitless. Most were too withdrawn, too deep in their own traumas to engage. A few seemed as disoriented as he felt, caught in a trance-like state of compliance, following the routine without question. But none of them spoke of the beneath. None seemed aware of the mysterious sealed area he had uncovered in the library. It wasn't until later in the afternoon, when Alex was wandering the halls aimlessly, that he stumbled upon something unexpected. A small door tucked into a forgotten alcove behind the janitor's closet. It was barely noticeable, its outline almost obscured by the cluttered shelves and cleaning supplies that lined the wall. But something about it caught his eye. The door was old, its wood worn and weathered. The metal handle gleamed with an unnatural polish, as if it had been recently cleaned. Alex's heart quickened. This was no ordinary door. This was the door that shouldn't be here. The door that hadn't been mentioned in any of the hospital's official records. The very door that the cryptic notes had warned him about. He approached cautiously, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was around. The hallway was deserted, the sounds of the hospital muted and distant. He reached for the handle, his hand trembling as his mind screamed at him to turn back. But he couldn't stop. The pull was irresistible. He turned the handle. The door creaked open, and Alex was immediately struck by the stale, damp air that rushed out from the crack. It smelled musty, like something had been locked away for far too long. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase, spiraling down into darkness. The air seemed thicker here, heavier with the weight of something forgotten, something waiting. Alex hesitated, his mind racing. This wasn't just a forgotten storage room. This was something more. But his curiosity was overwhelming, and the voices, faint but clear, seemed to beckon him forward. "We're down here," they whispered. "Hurry." Taking a deep breath, Alex stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind him with a finality that made his stomach drop. For a moment, the world went dark. His hand groped for the light switch, and when he found it, the single bulb above flickered weakly to life, casting long shadows against the walls. The staircase spiraled down, leading him deeper into the heart of the hospital. As he descended, the air grew colder. The walls seemed to close in, the stairwell narrow and claustrophobic. With every step, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. "Find us," they urged. "They're coming." The words no longer sounded like pleas. They felt like a warning. At the bottom of the stairs, Alex found himself standing before a steel door, its surface marked with deep scratches, as though something or someone had tried to claw their way through from the inside. The door was locked, but the rusted keyhole seemed to promise an answer. It was then that Alex noticed something strange. The door was not part of any official record. No mention of it existed in the files he had read. Yet here it was, staring back at him, as if it had always been waiting. His pulse quickened, his hand hovering over the cold, rusted handle. This was it, the entrance to whatever lay beneath the hospital. It was no longer just about the voices or the cryptic notes. Alex had uncovered something much darker, something the hospital wanted to remain buried. He pushed against the door, but it didn't budge. The steel was heavy, reinforced. He needed a way in. Desperation gnawed at him. The whispers had turned frantic, louder than before, as if they were now warning him of something else, something that was coming for him. Then he heard it, a faint sound behind him, a soft shuffle of footsteps. Someone else was down here. Someone who shouldn't be. Someone who had been waiting for him. Before Alex could react, the lights flickered and went out, plunging him into complete darkness. The door in front of him rattled violently, and the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. In the heavy silence that followed the flickering of the lights, Alex's heart raced. The darkness around him seemed to stretch endlessly, pressing in from all sides. Every sound, the soft shuffle of footsteps behind him, the rhythmic pounding of his own heartbeat, felt amplified, as if the darkness itself was alive, feeding off his fear. He stood frozen, his breath shallow, trying to make sense of the sudden change in the atmosphere. His instinct screamed at him to turn around, to find out who or what was there with him. But the fear, sharp and cold, kept him in place. The door ahead of him seemed to mock his hesitation, standing as the only barrier between him and whatever waited below. The darkness felt suffocating, and yet Alex knew he couldn't stay still. The voices had gone silent, but the absence of their murmurs only made the air feel heavier. It was as though they had been replaced by something far more sinister. With a trembling hand, he fumbled for his phone, but the screen remained blank. The battery had long since died. Of course it had. Everything was working against him. The lack of light made the staircase feel like a mouth ready to swallow him whole. But something else was gnawing at him now, a growing realization that something was very, very wrong. The footsteps behind him grew louder, closer, each one sharp against the cold stone floor. They weren't the steady, deliberate steps of a staff member, but the shuffling of someone or something, frenzied, disjointed, as though moving without purpose. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and Alex instinctively turned around, only to be met with an expanse of blackness. The sound stopped. There was nothing there. Then, just as suddenly as the darkness had settled around him, the light overhead flickered back on. The small bulb above buzzed, casting an eerie yellow glow over the room. It felt almost artificial, like the light had been waiting for the moment to return, to reassert its presence. For a moment, Alex wondered if it had never gone out at all. Had he imagined the complete blackout, or had something else interfered with it? The question gnawed at him, but it was quickly replaced by another, the door in front of him. The door that hadn't budged, the one that had rattled with a force that almost seemed human. He approached the steel door once more, his footsteps hesitant and slow, but something was different now. The air was colder, sharper, as if 1,000 eyes were watching him from the shadows, waiting for him to make his move. The door stood as it had been before, but now something had shifted. The handle seemed to glow faintly, an unnatural shimmer that hadn't been there before. Was it the reflection of the light above, or something else? The more Alex stared at it, the more it felt like the door itself was alive, reacting to his presence, almost as though it knew he was there. A deep, primal instinct surged within him to pull away, to leave this place before whatever was behind that door had a chance to reach him. But the voices, they were still there, murmuring in the back of his mind, their words more insistent now. "You have to go in. They're coming." Despite the fear tightening around his chest, Alex reached for the handle. He couldn't explain it, but something in him urged him on, some buried part of his mind telling him that he had no choice but to open it. His fingers closed around the cold metal, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. The whispering voices seemed to fade, almost as if they, too, were holding their breath. And then, with a creak that reverberated in his bones, the door slowly gave way, swinging open with a heavy groan. What Alex saw beyond the door wasn't what he expected. It wasn't the sterile, utilitarian hallway he thought would be there. No, it was something far worse, a corridor that stretched far beyond the physical limits of the hospital. The walls were lined with rusted pipes and old, decaying electrical cables. The floor was cracked and uneven, covered in patches of mold and dirt. But what struck him most were the walls themselves. There were strange markings, symbols carved deeply into the surface, some faded with time, others freshly scratched, as if someone had been trying to erase them and then started again. Alex stepped forward, compelled to explore this hidden part of the hospital, but every instinct within him told him to turn back. The corridor seemed to stretch on endlessly, its end shrouded in darkness, as though the space itself refused to be defined. The further he walked, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, the air thick with a smell of rot and decay that clung to his skin. His footsteps echoed, too loud in the silence, as if the corridor itself was alive, listening to his every move. The wall seemed to close in as Alex advanced, and then, through the gloom, he saw something that made his stomach drop. A figure, hunched and twisted, standing motionless at the end of the corridor. Its form was vague, indistinct, like a shadow that didn't belong, something out of place in a world where shadows had rules. Its eyes, if they were eyes, were impossibly dark, absorbing every scrap of light. It didn't move, didn't even acknowledge Alex's presence. But the feeling of being watched, hunted even, was overwhelming. Alex's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a patient. This wasn't a ghost or a figment of his imagination. This was something else, something he had no words for. And it was waiting for him. Just as he began to back away, the floor beneath him groaned, the ancient wood creaking under his feet. The figure at the end of the hall didn't move, but a sudden sound, like the scraping of metal on stone, broke the stillness. It was followed by a loud thud, something heavy and solid striking the ground. The wall beside him began to shift, as if it had been hiding something, and with a sudden crack, a new door opened, one that hadn't been there before. It was as though the hospital itself was alive, rearranging, shifting its walls, moving its corridors like a living organism. Alex had no choice but to move toward the new opening, his heart pounding in his chest, as the whispers returned once more, now louder, more frantic. "They're coming." The new door, much like the others Alex had encountered, had no handle. It opened of its own accord, sliding back, silently like the mouth of a cavern ready to swallow him whole. He had no choice but to move forward, pushed by the unrelenting pull of the voices and the oppressive darkness around him. As he stepped into the room beyond, the air shifted again, cooler, sharper, as though the temperature itself was reacting to his presence. The room was smaller than he had anticipated, but that didn't make it any less disorienting. At first glance, the room seemed almost mundane, with white walls that had yellowed with age and a single large mirror positioned directly across from where he had entered. It was an odd placement, as though the mirror was the focal point of the space, its glass surface gleaming even in the dim light. The rest of the room, however, was strangely sparse. There were no furniture, no medical equipment, nothing that would suggest it had ever been used for anything other than its current purpose as a trap. The mirror itself was imposing. The frame was ornate, carved from some dark, heavy wood that seemed to stretch unnaturally, curving and twisting into shapes that might have once been recognizable, but now seemed corrupted by time and neglect. The edges were chipped, the once polished surface now marred with smudges and cracks. Still, it gleamed in a way that no ordinary mirror should. Alex approached it cautiously, his feet dragging against the cold concrete floor, the unsettling quiet of the room pressing down on him. He couldn't explain it, but there was something about the mirror that felt wrong. It was as if it was waiting for him. Something in the way the glass reflected the light that made it seem almost eager. He took another hesitant step toward it, his hand unconsciously reaching out, though every part of him screamed to turn away. His fingers brushed against the surface of the mirror, and a jolt of cold shot through him. For a brief second, the reflection in the glass flickered. He stared at the mirror, expecting his own image to stare back. But what he saw was not the Alex he recognized. Instead, a different version of himself appeared, one with a dark, hollow expression. His reflection wore a grin that twisted unnaturally, stretching beyond the boundaries of a normal smile. It wasn't a pleasant grin, nor one that could be mistaken for a trick of light. It was raw and grotesque. The eyes of his reflection gleamed with a malicious intent that sent a wave of nausea through Alex. He stumbled back, heart racing, but the reflection did not move with him. It remained rooted, locked in place, watching him with those insidious eyes. For a moment, Alex could hardly breathe. He wanted to turn and run, but something kept him rooted in place, something about the mirror that pulled him in deeper. Slowly, as though moving against his will, he found himself stepping closer again, his eyes locked with the twisted version of himself. He couldn't look away, even though every instinct told him to. Then, without warning, the reflection in the mirror began to change. Slowly at first, but then more rapidly, it morphed, shifting in ways that seemed impossible. The face that had once been a mirror image of Alex's now became something else entirely. A faceless, empty void where its features should have been. A deep, gaping blackness replaced the eyes and mouth, swallowing every trace of what had been familiar. The room around him seemed to pulse in rhythm with the darkness in the mirror, as if the room itself was alive, reacting to whatever was being reflected. Alex stepped back again, his pulse racing, but this time, the reflection didn't follow. Instead, it seemed to draw closer, its faceless presence pressing against the glass, distorting the surface as though the mirror was no longer just glass. It had become a window to something far darker. He could feel the weight of the gaze on him, even though the eyes had disappeared. There was something profoundly wrong in that gaze, something that reached out beyond the realm of normal perception, beckoning him closer. For the first time since entering the hospital, Alex felt as if he had stumbled upon something far older, far more dangerous than he had realized. He had thought the corridors, the doors, the strange happenings were terrifying, but now he understood. This place, this hospital, wasn't just haunted by the patients it held or the secrets it buried. It was a vessel for something much worse. The mirror, he realized, wasn't a mere reflection of himself. It was showing him the thing lurking beneath the surface, the part of him that had been suppressed, locked away for years. Suddenly, the air around him seemed to thicken, as if the room itself was collapsing inward, pushing him closer to the mirror. The walls seemed to close in, drawing him toward the glass. It was as if the mirror was not just reflecting his image, but pulling him into it, into the darkness beyond. A voice, this time not a whisper, but a deep, resonant growl, rumbled through his mind. You cannot escape. Alex's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He tried to pull away, but his feet felt glued to the floor, his body refusing to obey him. The mirror was not just a window into another world. It was a portal, and it was slowly swallowing him whole. He could see his own reflection reaching out toward him, its arms stretched forward, as though it wanted to drag him into the void. The face, or what had been his face, grinned wider, the mouth stretching impossibly wide. A low, guttural laugh echoed from the depths of the mirror, filling the room with an all-encompassing sound. With every ounce of strength he had left, Alex forced himself to look away. The world around him blurred as he staggered back, breaking free from the pull of the mirror. His hands gripped the doorframe, his chest heaving as he fought for control of his breathing. But the laughter continued, growing louder, the voices now all merging into a single, mocking chorus. They were coming for him. He had to escape. He had to leave before it was too late. But as he stepped back into the hallway, he realized the door he had entered through had vanished. The corridor stretched out endlessly before him. Just as it had before, the walls now more suffocating than ever. There was no going back. And worse yet, something was still watching him. Something from beyond the mirror that wasn't quite done with him yet. The only thing Alex knew for certain was that he was no longer alone. Alex's mind was in a haze as he stumbled away from the mirror. His senses were overwhelmed, each new sound or flicker of light making his heart race with terror. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, an impossible corridor that seemed to go on forever. The oppressive weight of the silence was deafening, but there was something even more terrifying about it. No footsteps echoed, no distant murmurs could be heard. It was as though he was the last person left in the world. The hospital, or whatever it was now, felt abandoned by time itself. The further he walked, the more the walls seemed to close in on him. He was certain that the shadows in the corners of his eyes were moving, though each time he turned his head to look, they were gone. The darkness felt more alive here, pulsing with an energy that made Alex's skin crawl. He had no idea what was happening, but he was starting to feel that he wasn't just trapped physically in the hospital. It felt as though the place itself was trying to trap his mind, to bend his perception of reality until nothing made sense. His mind wandered back to the mirror, what he had seen there. The reflection, the faceless void, the laughter. It had felt so real. The way the glass had warped, as though it wasn't just a mirror anymore, but some kind of window into another dimension, a twisted version of his world. And that laugh, it had echoed in his mind even after he had left the room. It had sounded almost like a warning, a promise that something was still watching him. But there was no time to dwell on that now. He had to keep moving. There had to be an exit, a way out. He couldn't stay here, not with the hospital alive in its own way, shifting and changing around him. As he rounded another corner, his eyes caught sight of something unusual, an open door at the end of the hallway. The room was bathed in a warm, inviting light that seemed completely out of place in the otherwise oppressive darkness of the hospital. It almost looked like an office, with a small desk and a single chair placed neatly by the window. A soft hum of life seemed to emanate from the room, a stark contrast to the silence that had consumed the rest of the building. Alex's instincts screamed at him to turn back, to not enter. But his legs betrayed him, pushing him forward toward the light. It felt almost magnetic, drawing him closer against his will. He didn't understand why he couldn't stop himself. He should have been afraid, terrified even, but instead, he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him, as if the room represented something safe, a place where the hospital couldn't reach him. He entered the room cautiously, the door swinging closed behind him with a soft click. The room was simple, but inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile hallways he had been wandering through. The desk was cluttered with papers, medical charts, notebooks filled with scribbles, old photographs. There were no disturbing images here, no cryptic messages or signs of insanity. It felt normal, too normal. As Alex stepped closer to the desk, he noticed a single photograph that stood out from the rest. It was a picture of a group of people, all smiling. There were 5 of them, 2 men and 3 women. They were dressed in what looked like standard hospital uniforms, but there was a certain familiarity about them. Something in their eyes caught Alex's attention, a knowing look, as though they were sharing a secret. He squinted at the photograph, but the faces blurred when he tried to focus too hard on them. It was as if the image was trying to hide its true nature, to slip away from his understanding. Suddenly, a sharp sound cut through the silence, like a door opening. Alex spun around, heart pounding in his chest. The door behind him had opened again, but no one was there. He stepped toward the door, but as he did, the world seemed to warp again. The air thickened, and the edges of his vision began to blur. The room no longer seemed comforting. It felt claustrophobic, as though the walls were inching closer with every breath he took. His mind raced. Had he just seen someone? Had the photograph triggered something? Or was it just the stress playing tricks on him? It was impossible to tell. He turned back to the desk and scanned it again, his eyes landing on a small, worn journal buried beneath the papers. He reached for it, almost desperately, hoping for some answer, some explanation. The leather cover was cracked, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. But it was the handwriting that struck him. The words were written hastily, as though the person had been in a hurry, but the language was familiar. It was a medical journal, the entries detailing the patients who had been here, the treatments they had received. One entry stood out above the others. The date was recent, only a few days old. The entry read, "Patient 347. Subject has begun showing signs of increased awareness. Symptoms are not consistent with prior diagnoses. Subject reports vivid hallucinations of a mirror in the lower floors. Suggest further observation." The date of the entry sent a chill through Alex. Patient 347? Could that have been him? Was it possible that this hospital knew more about him than he did? The idea made his head spin, but there was no time to dwell on it. He flipped through more pages, but the words began to blur again. The hum of the room, once inviting, now sounded like static, like something was shifting in the background. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him, the sudden noise deafening in the silence of the room. Alex's heart hammered in his chest as the lights flickered. The room seemed to pulse in time with the flickering, as if it were alive. He reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The room had closed off from him, trapping him inside. His breathing became shallow, panic creeping up his spine as the walls seemed to close in, the once welcoming light now casting strange, long shadows that seemed to move on their own. In the corner of the room, the photograph of the 5 smiling people caught his eye once more. Only this time, there was no smile. The faces had changed, and in their place was a look of torment, their eyes wide with fear. And for the first time, Alex realized that the 5 people in the photograph were not strangers. They were him. Each of the faces reflected his own. He couldn't breathe. The air had thickened, turning to tar. The hospital had him now. It was never letting him go. Alex was no longer sure what was real and what was not. The walls, the corridors, the flickering lights, all had become part of a landscape that felt more like a nightmare than a hospital. He could hear the hum of the building around him, a sound that grew louder the longer he stood still, as if the very structure of the place was alive, watching, waiting. It was no longer just the strange, distorted lights or the shifting shadows. It felt as though the air itself had turned against him, tightening around him with every step he took. The photograph of his smiling face, those 5 faces, lingered in his mind, an eerie reminder that he was not just a patient here. He was part of something far darker, far more insidious than he could have imagined. The journal he had found was still clutched in his hand, its pages warm despite the chill in the room. He had read enough to know that this hospital was no ordinary institution. The mention of patient 347, combined with the photographs, told him that he was part of an experiment. But what kind of experiment? What was this place trying to accomplish, and why had he been chosen? These questions gnawed at him, but every time he tried to form a coherent thought, it was as if his mind slipped away, like trying to grasp water in his hands. His vision blurred again as he walked down the now familiar hallways. The familiar monotony of the fluorescent lights above, the smell of antiseptic, the feeling of isolation, they all combined to create a sense of suffocating dread. There were moments when he thought he heard footsteps echoing behind him, but when he spun around, no one was there. This hospital, it seemed, didn't operate on normal time. The seconds stretched, became hours, and then collapsed into a blur, leaving Alex with the strange sensation that the building itself was playing with his perception of time. He stopped at the end of another hallway, where an old, rusted door stood slightly ajar. The cold air that rushed through the cracks seemed inviting, offering a hint of escape, though he knew better than to trust it. His hand trembled as he pushed the door open, the sound of metal scraping against metal sending a sharp shiver down his spine. What lay beyond the door was not another sterile office or waiting room. It was a stairwell, steep and narrow, descending into darkness. But there was something about it that called to him, something he couldn't ignore. With no other direction to go, Alex stepped into the stairwell, his footfalls echoing in the confined space. The air here was thick with dust, each breath tasting stale, but the further he descended, the more the darkness seemed to press against him. The walls were damp, the steps slick beneath his shoes, and there was an odd smell in the air, something metallic sharp. He couldn't quite place it, but it made his stomach turn. The deeper he went, the more the shadows seemed to move. It was as though they weren't just the absence of light, but entities in their own right, shifting and contorting as he passed. Alex's heart pounded in his chest as he continued, driven by the nagging feeling that he was being drawn towards something important. Perhaps it was the need for answers. Perhaps it was the instinctual drive for survival. But something in the pit of his stomach told him that whatever he was about to find would either give him the truth or destroy him completely. The stairs ended abruptly at a heavy, reinforced door, unlike anything else in the hospital. The metal was cold to the touch, and the markings on it seemed wrong, like they had been scratched there in haste, or even desperation. It was a door designed to keep people in, not let them out. And yet, Alex felt a strange pull toward it, like some invisible force was compelling him to open it. His breath came in shallow bursts as he pushed against the door. To his surprise, it creaked open easily, as though it had been waiting for him. Beyond the door was a room, but not one he had seen before. The walls were lined with old monitors, their screens flickering with static. Wires snaked across the floor, some plugged into machines that hummed quietly, others trailing off into the darkness. In the center of the room was a large glass tank, its contents obscured by a haze of fog. The sight of it sent a jolt of fear through Alex's spine, but it was the presence in the corner of the room that truly made his blood run cold. A figure sat in the shadows, its face obscured by the low light. It was difficult to make out, but Alex could sense its presence. Its eyes, though invisible, seemed to be focused entirely on him. He froze, his body tensing, as the figure slowly rose from the corner, its movement deliberate, yet unnatural. The air around him grew colder, the shadows deeper, as if the figure was drawing the darkness toward it. It stepped forward, revealing its face, or rather, the absence of one. The creature before him had no face, no distinguishing features. It was as if it had been erased from existence itself, its skin smooth and featureless, like an unmarked canvas. Alex's heart raced as the figure took another step toward him, the air growing thicker with each movement. He wanted to run, to scream, but his body refused to obey. The creature's presence seemed to press down on him, filling his lungs with an icy, suffocating weight. It raised its hand, pointing toward the glass tank. Alex's gaze followed the gesture, and as he did, the fog inside the tank began to clear. What he saw made his stomach churn. The tank was filled with bodies, pale, lifeless bodies floating in some viscous fluid. They were connected to the machines by a series of tubes and wires, their limbs limp, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Alex's mind reeled, unable to process the grotesque sight before him. These were not patients, not people who had come to this hospital for treatment. These were experiments, test subjects, victims of whatever dark purpose this place served. A low, rasping voice broke through the silence, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing in the very core of his being. "You are the next. There is no escape." The words hit Alex like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his hands shaking, his mind struggling to comprehend the enormity of what he had just discovered. The figure in front of him stepped forward again, and for the first time, Alex saw its eyes, deep, hollow voids that seemed to consume everything around them. And in those eyes, he saw something terrible. He saw himself. It was then that Alex realized the horrifying truth. He wasn't just a patient here. He was part of the experiment. The hospital, the creatures, the faces in the photographs. They were all part of a twisted game, a test to see how far the human mind could be pushed before it broke. And Alex had just taken his first step toward the inevitable collapse of his own sanity. There was no way out. The revelation that Alex had become part of some grotesque experiment was a harsh blow to his fragile sense of reality. It was not just a matter of being a patient or a participant in a medical trial. He had crossed into a territory where the rules of survival were twisted, where the boundaries between sanity and madness blurred into oblivion. The creatures that inhabited this place, the monstrous figure with no face, the bodies in the tank, all were part of something far larger than Alex had ever imagined. There was no escape from this maze, no way to free himself from the suffocating grip of the hospital's dark purpose. As the weight of his discovery settled over him, he began to feel something else, an overwhelming sense of helplessness. The creature's words echoed in his mind, reverberating through the empty hallways and into the corners of his thoughts. You are the next. There is no escape. His first instinct had been to run, to flee from the room and find any way out. But as he turned to leave, the hallway beyond him stretched endlessly, as if mocking his attempt at escape. The walls were alive, pulsating with an eerie rhythm, the flickering lights casting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The air grew colder, and the hum of the hospital, once a background noise, now seemed like a living entity, breathing, waiting. Alex's mind struggled to make sense of what was happening. He had to find answers, had to understand the meaning of his involvement in this twisted scenario. But how could he when everything around him felt like a fever dream? Each corridor he traversed led to another. Each door he opened seemed to conceal more secrets than the last. The hospital was a maze of contradictory messages, sanity and insanity, light and shadow, life and death. Each element intertwined, each space haunted by the possibility that there was no clear distinction between what was real and what was part of the experiment. In the moments of stillness, as he wandered aimlessly through the labyrinthine halls, Alex could feel the hospital watching him, its cold, unseen eyes never leaving him. It was as if the very walls knew his every thought, his every fear. He could not escape its grip, not even for a moment. The creatures, the figures without faces, the bodies in the tanks, they were all part of the building's soul, or whatever passed for it. Each time he looked over his shoulder, there was a sensation that something was following him, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The journal he had found earlier, its pages filled with cryptic, disturbing details, had given him a glimpse into the nature of the hospital's experiments. Patient 347, the one whose face was blurred in every photograph, was not a mere patient. Alex had pieced together enough to suspect that the hospital was involved in something far darker than mental health treatment. The notes had spoken of consciousness manipulation, of altering minds in ways that defied conventional science. But who was conducting these experiments, and why? And who had signed his name as a participant? The journal offered no concrete answers, only more questions, each more terrifying than the last. As Alex turned another corner, he encountered something new, a door that was neither rusted nor locked, but strangely pristine in comparison to the rest of the hospital. It seemed out of place, its smooth, gleaming surface standing in stark contrast to the crumbling decay of everything else. A faint sound came from behind it, a low, rhythmic tapping, almost like a heartbeat. He was drawn to it, compelled to open the door despite every ounce of rationality telling him to turn away. He hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. For a moment, he considered the consequences of what might lie beyond. Another room, another twisted reality. But his curiosity won out. With a deep breath, he turned the handle and pushed the door open. What he found inside was something he had never expected, a mirror. The mirror was large, occupying most of the wall, framed in ornate, gilded wood. But it was not the mirror itself that struck Alex. It was the reflection. In the glass, he saw not his own face, but the faces of the other patients he recognized from the photographs. The faces were distorted, writhing as though trapped in the glass, their expressions contorted in silent screams. The reflection shifted as he approached, the faces twisting into different forms, some familiar, others unrecognizable. They all seemed to reach out toward him, pulling him into their nightmare. Frozen in place, Alex reached out toward the mirror. His fingers brushed against the surface, and as soon as they made contact, the reflection shifted again. This time, his own face appeared in the glass, but it was not as he remembered it. His skin was pale, his eyes hollow, as though something vital had been drained from him. He could barely recognize himself, the figure in the mirror a ghostly version of who he had been just hours ago. His heart raced, panic rising in his chest as the world around him seemed to distort. The mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was a window into something else, something more terrifying. He could feel his identity slipping away, his sense of self unraveling before his eyes. He stepped back, his mind reeling from the disorienting effect of the mirror. But when he tried to turn away, the room seemed to warp. The walls closed in on him, the air thickening as the sounds of the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was then that Alex realized the hospital was not just a physical space. It was a mind of its own, a living entity that fed off his fear, his confusion, his very soul. He was not just a victim of the experiments. He was becoming part of the hospital itself, absorbed into its dark heart. The tapping grew louder, now unmistakably a voice, whispering his name, calling him back into the depths of this endless nightmare. In a last, desperate attempt to free himself from the hospital's hold, Alex turned and bolted for the door. But as he reached for the handle, he felt it, a cold hand gripping his wrist, pulling him back. He spun around, but no one was there. It was as if the very walls had reached out and seized him. Panic surged through him as he tried to break free, but the grip tightened, pulling him toward the mirror. His body felt like lead, his movements sluggish as though his limbs were no longer his own. With one final primal scream, Alex tried to fight back, but it was too late. The hospital had him, and there was no escape from its grip. The walls closed in around him, and in the dark, his identity vanished. What remained was nothing more than a reflection, a hollow shell in the endless maze of the hospital's mind. And somewhere, in the deep recesses of the building, his image was now part of the collection of faces that had been consumed. The experiment had claimed another victim. Alex's body was heavy, his limbs reluctant to obey his will. Yet there was something in his mind, a flickering, a faint spark that refused to be extinguished. In the aftermath of his encounter with the mirror, the hospital seemed different. The walls, once ominously silent, now echoed with a soft, murmuring hum, as though the building itself had grown more aware of his presence. Or was it that he had become aware of it? There was a disorienting blurring of boundaries between the two. The hospital was no longer just a place of physical confinement. It was something alive, something that interacted with him, fed off him, perhaps even controlled his every move. The whispers had begun again, this time in a low, guttural tone that vibrated in his bones. They were neither words nor sounds, but an impression, a pressure on his mind, as though thoughts that did not belong to him were being pressed into his consciousness. Every step he took seemed to carry him deeper into the labyrinth, a maze that now twisted and writhed like an organic entity. The very air around him felt thick, and Alex could sense, as if through his skin, that the walls were listening to his every breath, his every thought. His body seemed to move without his consent, as if guided by something outside of himself. He had no control, no direction. He thought of the mirror, those faces that had contorted before him, their eyes pleading, their mouths open in silent screams. He thought of the figure in the hallway, the faceless creature that had been more than a mere apparition. It had been part of something larger, something far more sinister. What had it said? "You are the next. There is no escape." The words rang in his ears, repeating, looping endlessly. His mind tried to make sense of them, but every attempt was met with a wall of impenetrable fog. The hospital was not just an institution for the mentally ill. It was a prison for the mind itself, a place where reality was deconstructed, where thoughts could be twisted and manipulated into something monstrous. Alex had become a part of that machinery, an unwilling cog in a monstrous experiment that seemed to have no beginning and no end. But what was the purpose of it all? What did they want from him? And why did he feel as though the very essence of his being was slipping away, piece by piece, as if his identity was being consumed? As he wandered through the sterile hallways, the silence became more oppressive. It was not a peaceful stillness, but the kind that clung to you, suffocating every thought, erasing every possibility. The hum of the building seemed to grow louder, vibrating through the floor beneath his feet. There were no windows, no open doors to the outside world. He was trapped in a space where time had no meaning, a place where everything had been suspended, caught in a limbo between life and death. Suddenly, a door opened ahead of him, its hinges creaking in the otherwise still air. For a moment, Alex hesitated. It was too sudden, too convenient, but his curiosity, his instinct to seek answers, propelled him forward. He stepped inside, and the door closed softly behind him. The room was dimly lit, the only source of illumination a single bulb that flickered intermittently. On the far side of the room was a table, and on it, a series of photographs arranged in neat rows. The photographs were eerily familiar. They depicted patients, no, not patients. They were fragments of people, faces that had once been whole, but were now distorted, twisted in unnatural ways. The faces were all marked by the same haunting feature. Their eyes were wide, empty, their gazes fixed on something just beyond the frame. Alex felt a cold sweat bead on his forehead as he realized the truth. These were not just patients of the hospital. They were the faces from the mirror, the ones he had seen before. The ones that had been trapped in the glass. As he stared at the photographs, the flickering light above him cast long, twisted shadows across the walls, and the murmuring voices grew louder, more insistent. They were not coming from the room. They were coming from his own mind, crawling beneath his skin, filling his thoughts with fragments of memories, of moments that were no longer his own. It was as if the hospital was reaching into his past, manipulating his memories, forcing him to relive them. He saw flashes of his own life before the hospital, moments of happiness, of mundane routine, of laughter. But then those memories were overtaken by others, strange, foreign memories that had no place in his life. The faces in the photographs, the whispers, the experiments. For a moment, Alex felt a sense of recognition. These were the faces of people who had come before him. He could see the same look in their eyes, the same hollow emptiness. They had all been here before him, and they had all been consumed by the hospital, just as he was now. The experiment had been ongoing, an endless cycle of manipulation and destruction. And in the center of it all was him, the next subject, the next face to be lost in the void of this place. The room around him seemed to shift. The photographs blurred and warped, their edges bending like smoke curling in the air. Alex stumbled back, his mind racing. There was something deeply wrong here, something beyond the physical. The hospital wasn't just experimenting on the body. It was experimenting on the mind, on the very fabric of identity itself. And now, Alex was part of that experiment. His mind was being reshaped, bent, and twisted in ways he could not comprehend. In his panic, Alex turned toward the door, but it was no longer there. The walls had closed in on him, and the room had dissolved into darkness. The photographs, the table, the flickering light, they were all gone, replaced by an endless black void. His heart pounded in his chest, his breathing shallow as he reached out into the darkness, desperate to find something, anything, to anchor him. But there was nothing, only the endless silence. Then in the distance he heard it, a voice. No, several voices, murmuring in unison. "You are the next." The words echoed in the void, growing louder with every repetition, until they drowned out everything else. Alex's thoughts, his identity, everything he had once known, was slipping away, absorbed by the cold, suffocating embrace of the hospital. And in that moment, Alex realized something terrifying. He was not just a patient. He was a part of the hospital itself, an echo of the countless souls who had been lost in its depths. There was no escape, no way out. The experiment had claimed him. Alex woke up with a sharp breath, his chest rising and falling as though he had been submerged underwater and had just broken the surface. The overwhelming weight of the hospital still clung to him, as did the disorienting sense of unreality. Was he dreaming? Had everything he experienced so far been some twisted creation of his mind? Or was it possible that the hospital itself was warping his perception of reality? The questions echoed in his mind like a cacophony of voices. Voices that sounded all too familiar, though they belonged to no one he could place. The room he found himself in was unfamiliar, yet its sterile, oppressive atmosphere bore a haunting resemblance to every other room he had encountered in the hospital. He sat up slowly, disoriented, trying to piece together how he had arrived in this new place. There were no windows, no visible clocks to give any sense of time. The walls seemed to pulse ever so slightly, as though they were alive, breathing with him. He reached out instinctively to touch the rough surface of the nearest wall, but the sensation was unnervingly soft, as though it had shifted under his fingers. There was something fundamentally wrong with the texture, a deceptive pliability that felt more like skin than stone. Rising to his feet, Alex turned toward the door. It was the only way out, he told himself. But as he crossed the room, the very air seemed to change. It grew thicker, as though the atmosphere itself was pushing back against him. With each step, his movement slowed, resistance growing with every inch. He struggled to reach the door handle, but as his hand brushed against it, the door warped before his eyes. It was as though the space itself had contorted, stretching and shrinking. The handle twisted out of shape, and with a final, sickening squelch, the door dissolved into the walls, leaving him trapped in the room. Panic gripped him, and he began to pace frantically, searching for any exit, any crack in the unyielding surface of the walls. But the more he moved, the more the room seemed to expand, the walls stretching outward in unnatural directions. It was as though he were in some kind of labyrinth, and with each step, he moved further away from any semblance of reality. There were no corners, no edges, just an endless, twisting void. The very fabric of the space around him seemed to be made of illusion, a nightmare that shifted at will, rendering him helpless to escape. Suddenly, a sound broke the stillness. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it quickly grew louder. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, as though someone or something was approaching. Alex froze, straining his ears to listen. The footsteps echoed through the room, but when he tried to move toward the source, the sound seemed to shift and travel away, like shadows fleeing from the light. The ground beneath him trembled slightly, and the walls began to groan, as though the building itself were alive. Then, just as quickly as the footsteps had begun, they stopped. A heavy silence followed, oppressive and thick. Alex stood motionless, his heart hammering in his chest. He wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, but he was afraid of the response, afraid that whatever was out there, whatever was controlling this place, might hear him and use it against him. And yet he couldn't stay silent. He couldn't continue to walk in this suffocating, shifting maze. He had to know what was happening. He took a deep breath, summoning the courage to move forward. But as he did, the room seemed to change once again. The walls, which had been featureless before, now had markings, scratches, deep and jagged, as though something had clawed at them in desperation. They grew closer with each passing moment, until they formed a coherent pattern. Alex recognized them. They were symbols, strange and arcane, etched into the walls in a way that made his skin crawl. Some were familiar, while others seemed completely foreign. Yet somehow, all of them spoke to something deep within him, something he couldn't quite place. His eyes were drawn to a symbol in the center of the room, a spiral, its edges curling inward endlessly. It seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, pulling him toward it as if it were a magnet. He couldn't resist, even as his mind screamed at him to run. Something inside him urged him forward, and his feet moved, almost of their own accord. Each step was heavy, as though the ground was trying to suck him down into its depths. As Alex neared the center of the spiral, the room seemed to collapse around him. The walls contracted, the floor rose, and the air thickened, pressing in on him from all sides. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, casting an eerie light that danced across the room in impossible patterns. Alex closed his eyes, but it was no use. He could still feel the pull, still hear the whispers that were now louder than ever, surrounding him in a chaotic blend of voices. Some were familiar, some alien, but all of them demanded his attention, each one urging him to give in, to lose himself in the noise. In a split second, the world around him shattered. The room splintered into thousands of pieces, each fragment spinning away from the center as though reality itself had cracked. The walls were gone, the symbols were gone, and in their place was something far worse, a reflection of himself. For a moment, Alex didn't recognize the face staring back at him. It was him, yes, but distorted, pale, eyes hollow, skin stretched too tightly over his bones. It was as if the very essence of who he was had been erased, replaced by something twisted. But then the reflection blinked, and Alex felt his own body shudder in response. The figure in the mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was alive, moving, watching him. The realization hit him like a cold wave. Whatever this place was, it had consumed more than his body. It had devoured his mind, his soul, and now it was trying to replace him entirely. He had become nothing more than a passenger in his own body, a specter, caught between the shifting realities of the hospital. And as the reflection in the mirror reached out toward him, Alex could do nothing but stare, paralyzed by the horror of his own fate. The room around him was no longer shifting. It had become an extension of himself. He was trapped within his own mind, surrounded by the very essence of his identity, slowly crumbling away into nothing. The sensation of being trapped in his own mind clung to Alex like a heavy fog. It was suffocating, oppressive, and the longer he stood there, staring at his distorted reflection, the more he felt like he was dissolving into it. His body, once solid and real, seemed to flicker, caught between this world and something darker, something he couldn't touch or understand. It wasn't just the physical space of the hospital that was twisting. It was his very sense of self, stretching and unraveling, piece by piece. The mirror, no, the reflection, was not just showing him a warped version of himself. It was showing his past, his failures, the things he had tried to bury. Alex had always been haunted by the things he had done, by the guilt that followed him like a shadow. But now, standing in this surreal space, those memories were flooding back, more vivid and intense than ever before. He could see himself as a child, lost and terrified, his father's harsh voice echoing in his ears. He saw his teenage years, filled with reckless decisions, the inability to trust anyone, the isolation that slowly ate away at him. And then there were the more recent years, his struggles with relationships, the broken promises, and the sense of failure that gnawed at him constantly. But none of those memories felt like his own. They were detached, as though they belonged to someone else. His past was being rewritten, repurposed by whatever force held sway over the hospital. Alex reached out to touch the glass, as if trying to shake himself free from the pull of those memories. But when his fingers made contact, the surface rippled like water, and a new image appeared. It was him, standing in front of the very door he had tried to open earlier. Only this time he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a figure, just out of focus, a shadow that seemed to shift with the flicker of the light. It was a person, someone familiar, yet entirely unknown. The shadow lingered there, always on the edge of his vision, just far enough to keep him from identifying it. It was as if the hospital was showing him something he wasn't meant to understand, something it wanted him to forget, but couldn't. A part of him wanted to look closer, to reach out again, but he knew the risk. Every time he tried to confront the unknown, it only pulled him deeper into the labyrinth of this nightmare. With a frustrated growl, Alex backed away from the mirror. He needed to escape, to break free of the cycle of visions and distortions. The room, if it could even be called that, seemed to press in on him. The walls, once soft and pliable, had hardened again, and the air had thickened to the point where he could barely breathe. He was suffocating, both in the physical space and in the weight of his own past. It was as though the hospital had tapped into his deepest fears and regrets, pulling them from his mind and forcing him to face them, even if it meant losing himself in the process. Turning toward the door, if that's what it could still be called, he stepped forward with determination. But just as he was about to grasp the handle, a noise shattered the silence. A low, mournful sound, like a door creaking on its hinges, followed by a soft scrape, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. The noise was coming from somewhere deeper within the hospital, but its source was unclear. Alex's heart raced as the sound grew louder, more persistent. It wasn't just a random noise. It was deliberate, a message, or perhaps a warning. And with each passing second, it seemed to grow more insistent. The weight of the sound pressed in on him, reverberating through his chest. He could feel it in his bones, in his pulse, and yet it seemed to come from nowhere, all around him, and from deep within the walls. The longer he listened, the more it felt like the sound was calling to him, urging him to follow. But what would he find if he did? More of his own broken memories? A deeper descent into the madness that was already consuming him? He turned away from the door, walking in the direction of the sound. It was futile, he knew. He didn't know where it was coming from, or even if it was real. But in this place, where reality was malleable and constantly shifting, what was real and what was imagined were blurred beyond recognition. The farther he walked, the more he became aware of the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just a sensation anymore. It was tangible, pressing in on him from all sides. The walls, once neutral and oppressive, now seemed to lean toward him, as if closing in. He tried to push forward, but each step seemed to grow heavier, his legs growing stiff, unwilling to move. The hospital's grip on him was tightening, and with it, his mind felt more and more clouded, like he was losing touch with reality altogether. His thoughts were no longer his own. They had become tangled in the web of this place, and he wasn't sure where he ended and the hospital began. Eventually, he came to a halt in front of another door, this one far more ornate than any he had seen so far. It was made of dark wood, the grain twisting in strange, unnatural patterns. A strange sense of dread settled over him as he stared at it. Something about the door felt different. This wasn't just another locked room. This was something worse, something that held a power far beyond his understanding. He didn't want to open it. He knew that doing so might mean the end of everything he had left, the last shred of his own identity. But at the same time, he felt an undeniable pull. It was the same feeling that had led him down this dark path in the first place. The need to understand, to confront whatever haunted this place, and perhaps himself. He placed his hand on the door. The wood was cold to the touch, and as he pushed it open, the room beyond was revealed. Unlike the others, this space was bright, almost blindingly so. It was sterile and clean, with no signs of decay or rot. In the center of the room stood a solitary figure, a person cloaked in shadows. Their face was obscured, but Alex could feel the weight of their gaze. They were waiting for him, as if they had always known he would come. And with that realization, Alex understood something terrifying. The hospital had not just been watching him. It had been waiting for him to return. Alex stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to breathe. The room before him was both strange and eerily familiar. The harsh fluorescent lights above bathed the space in a sterile white glow, casting long shadows along the pristine walls. But despite its cleanliness, there was a suffocating quality to the room. It felt as though it was too perfect, too curated, as though it had been built for the sole purpose of trapping something, or someone, in its unervingly controlled environment. His pulse quickened as he took in the figure, standing motionless in the center of the room. The figure was clothed in what appeared to be a hospital gown, much like the ones he had seen throughout the institution. But it wasn't the outfit that caught his attention. It was the stillness, the silence that hung in the air around them. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge his presence. It simply stood there, as though waiting for something to unfold. Alex felt the weight of their unblinking stare, even though their face was obscured by shadows. There was no question in his mind that this was no ordinary person. The longer he looked, the more he felt that this figure wasn't just waiting for him. It was expecting him. An unsettling thought crept into his mind. Was this what the hospital had been preparing him for all along? He had been pulled through a maze of horrors, subjected to endless shifts in reality, each more disorienting than the last. Every room he had entered seemed designed to push him further into madness. But this felt different. This was not just another room. This was a confrontation, a reckoning, and he had been drawn here like a moth to a flame, helpless in its pull. Alex stepped forward cautiously, each footfall heavy with uncertainty. His body felt alien to him, as though it belonged to someone else. He had no idea how he had come to be standing here, but he knew he could not turn back. The moment his foot crossed the threshold of the room, the air seemed to thicken. The pressure around him intensified, as if the room itself was alive and aware of his every move. A cold sweat broke out along the back of his neck as his thoughts swirled in a storm of confusion. Was he dreaming? Had he lost his grip on reality altogether? He wanted to reach out, to scream, to wake himself up from this twisted nightmare. But something deep inside told him that doing so would only plunge him deeper into the abyss. As he approached the figure, his steps became heavier, as though the ground itself was pushing back against him. The figure remained motionless, its back turned to him, its posture unnervingly rigid. Despite the stillness, Alex could feel a pulse of energy emanating from it, like the faint hum of electricity just beneath the surface. There was power here, an unseen force that made his skin crawl. He had been in many strange places during his time in the hospital, but nothing had felt like this before. There was a dark intelligence in the air, a presence that seemed to peer into the deepest corners of his mind. He reached out, his hand trembling as he closed the distance. The figure didn't flinch, didn't react in any way. It was as though it was made of stone, unmoving and unyielding. And yet, there was something about it that seemed alive, something more than just a passive observer. The closer Alex got, the more he realized that the figure was somehow waiting for him to make a choice. This room, this moment, was about something beyond just escaping the hospital or confronting his past. It was about understanding what this place truly wanted from him. His breath hitched as a thought flashed through his mind. Perhaps this figure wasn't a person at all. Maybe it was a manifestation, a part of the hospital itself, a reflection of the twisted force that had been controlling everything around him. But the more he thought about it, the less certain he became. What if the hospital was him, in some way? What if it had been built on his fear, his guilt, his deepest regrets? He couldn't be sure of anything anymore. Who are you? The question escaped his lips before he could stop it. It sounded strange, as though the words didn't belong to him. The figure remained silent, unyielding. For a moment, the room seemed to grow colder, the silence more oppressive. The longer Alex stood there, the more it felt like the figure's gaze was penetrating him, tearing down the walls he had so carefully constructed. It was as if they were seeing the very core of him, his failures, his self-loathing, his terror. Every thought, every emotion was laid bare, exposed for this silent observer to witness. The figure did not answer, but Alex could feel something shifting in the air. The energy in the room was thickening, like smoke swirling around them, and for the first time, Alex felt truly vulnerable. His legs felt weak, his thoughts a blur. He had never been so exposed. Every inch of him screamed for escape, for a way out of this suffocating reality. But there was no escape. The room was closing in on him, the walls pressing against him, the air growing thicker with every passing second. Suddenly the figure moved. It was subtle at first, a slight shift, a breath, a faint turn of the head. But in that moment, Alex knew that the waiting was over. The figure was no longer just observing. It was alive. It was aware. And it was waiting for him to make his next move. The figure's face remained hidden, but Alex felt a sharp stab of recognition. He didn't know how or why, but somehow he was certain that this person, or whatever they were, knew him. They knew everything about him. The realization sent a shiver down Alex's spine. The hospital had not just been manipulating him. It had been preparing him for this confrontation, for this moment. The figure was a mirror, a reflection of everything Alex had avoided, everything he had been running from. And now it was time to face it all. But before Alex could react, the figure spoke, its voice low and chilling. "You're not ready." Alex's heart pounded in his chest as the figure's words echoed in his mind, reverberating through the empty room. You're not ready." He could hardly breathe as the weight of those words settled heavily over him. The figure, despite its cold and distant posture, seemed to have peeled back the layers of his mind, exposing the rawest parts of his soul. The air felt electric, charged with a tension that seemed to tighten around him with every breath he took. In that moment, the hospital no longer felt like just a place. It felt like a living, breathing entity, an extension of something much darker and far more sinister than Alex could have ever imagined. The figure's statement hung in the air like a challenge. Alex had thought he was finally getting closer to understanding the twisted game the hospital had set in motion for him. But now, it felt as if he was being pushed back to square one, as if the walls were closing in on him once more. His hands trembled as he clenched them into fists, a desperate attempt to hold on to some semblance of control. It felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted again, throwing him off balance and making everything feel distant and impossible to grasp. Alex tried to speak, but no words came out. He had so many questions, so many things he wanted to ask, the questions that had been brewing in his mind ever since he first entered this place. But all that came out was a strangled gasp. It was as though the very act of speaking had been stripped from him, as though even his voice was under the hospital's control. He took a step back, unsure of what to do next. Everything he had experienced in the past few days, his time in the hospital, the disturbing encounters, the warped sense of time and space, suddenly seemed to blur into one terrifying, inescapable nightmare. The figure remained motionless, its head slightly tilted as if studying him. It didn't offer an explanation, nor did it give any indication of what it wanted. Alex could feel its gaze, though its eyes were still obscured by the shadows. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. He could no longer ignore the chilling sense that something was horribly wrong. The figure's words had not just been a simple refusal. They had been a declaration. Alex was not ready. But for what? What was he being prepared for? And more importantly, who or what had made the decision that he wasn't ready? The room seemed to darken as Alex stood there, lost in his thoughts. The stark, sterile walls began to close in around him, their once comforting white hue now feeling claustrophobic. He could sense the presence of the hospital itself, watching him, feeding off his uncertainty. For the first time since his arrival, he felt utterly alone, the eerie stillness of the room pressing down on him with an unbearable weight. He thought back to the other patients, to the strange and disturbing encounters he had witnessed, each moment adding to the growing realization that the institution was not what it appeared to be. It was as though the hospital had been designed to distort reality, to trap its occupants in an endless loop of confusion and fear. Alex's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. What was the purpose of this? Why had he been drawn into this twisted game? He thought about the figure standing before him, this strange being that seemed to hold the key to everything but remained just out of reach. He had never been one for belief in the supernatural, but everything he had seen and felt here defied explanation. He could no longer dismiss the idea that there was something beyond the hospital's physical walls, something darker and more powerful than he could ever hope to comprehend. The figure took a slow step forward, its movement deliberate and measured. It wasn't until it was just a few feet away that Alex noticed something strange. The figure's features were still obscured in shadow, but there was something about its presence that had shifted. The stillness was gone. There was a sense of urgency now, an energy crackling in the air between them. The figure opened its mouth, and for a brief moment, Alex thought it might speak again. But instead, it reached out with one long, slender hand, as if offering something or warning him of something. Instinctively, Alex stepped back, his heart racing. He wasn't sure what the figure was trying to convey, but it felt as though he was being presented with a choice, one that could alter everything. He glanced around the room, the four walls now feeling oppressive, like they were closing in on him. His mind reeled with possibilities. Was he being given a way out? A chance to escape this nightmare? Or was this another test? Another twisted game designed to push him to the edge of his sanity? Do you understand what is happening here? The figure's voice was a whisper, almost imperceptible, but the words sent a shiver down Alex's spine. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He didn't understand anything anymore. The hospital was a labyrinth of confusion and terror, and every attempt to make sense of it only led him deeper into its nightmarish grip. But one thing was certain: he had to try. He had to find a way out, even if it meant facing whatever this figure, or the hospital itself, was preparing him for. In that moment, Alex realized something terrifying. The hospital had been guiding him all along, not to an escape, but to an inevitable confrontation. Every encounter, every moment of fear, every twist of reality had been pushing him toward this moment. The figure wasn't here to offer him an answer. It was here to show him the truth that he had been avoiding, the truth that had been buried deep within him, waiting to be uncovered. And no matter how hard he tried, he could no longer deny it. He was part of the story, a part of the hospital's twisted design, and there was no turning back now. As Alex stared at the figure, the room seemed to grow colder still, the air thickening with tension. The walls pressed in on him, but in the midst of his fear, a strange clarity began to settle over him. The hospital was not a place to be escaped. It was a place to be understood, and in order to escape its grip, he would have to face whatever truths lay buried within himself. Only then would he be ready. The next few days felt like a blur to Alex. Time had become a disorienting mess within the walls of the hospital. He couldn't tell whether hours or days had passed since his encounter with the figure. The once familiar routine of the facility now seemed to shift and warp, as though the very essence of the hospital had begun to seep into his mind. He had tried to force his thoughts back to some semblance of normalcy, to hold on to his sense of reality, but it was clear that the boundaries between what was real and what was imagined were no longer distinct. Alex found himself wandering the halls aimlessly, often retracing his steps as if trying to escape the nagging sense of déjà vu that clung to him. The staff were becoming increasingly distant, their eyes hollow and blank, as if they were merely going through the motions of their work. It wasn't until he overheard a conversation between two nurses, murmuring in low tones about the new arrival, that Alex realized something even more unsettling was at play. They spoke as if he weren't even there, as if he had become part of the hospital's machinery, one of its many parts that could be ignored without consequence. This realization hit him harder than he could have imagined. Had he become invisible, a mere cog in the system? He had come to this place seeking answers, hoping to untangle the mystery that had ensnared him. Yet, now it seemed that he had become as trapped as the other patients. They, too, wandered aimlessly through the halls, their faces blank with the kind of resignation that only a place like this could instill. Alex's thoughts darkened as he wondered just how much of himself had been stripped away, how much of his will had been corroded by the hospital's oppressive grip. His brief moments of clarity were interrupted by strange, fleeting visions. Faces that he didn't recognize appeared before him, only to disappear the next second. Shadowy figures that seemed to watch him from the corners of rooms, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. He could feel the hospital watching him, analyzing him, waiting for him to break. And break he did. It started slowly, at first small cracks in his psyche, the ones that were easy to ignore. The fatigue was constant, gnawing at him like a hunger he could never satisfy. He found himself forgetting simple things, where he had left his belongings, the names of the nurses, the days of the week. Each moment bled into the next, indistinguishable from the last. His body felt heavy, as though it no longer belonged to him. His mind drifted, carried on currents he could not control. There was a dull ache in the back of his head that never seemed to fade. One morning, Alex awoke to a new sensation, an overwhelming feeling of vertigo. The room around him twisted, and for a brief moment, he felt as if the entire world had been turned upside down. The walls seemed to stretch and contract, their edges blurring into an abstract swirl of shadows. His breath quickened, his chest tightening with a panic he hadn't felt in days. He tried to sit up, but his body felt too heavy, as though it were no longer entirely his own. His limbs were sluggish, unresponsive. He grasped for the bedposts, but they seemed to move just out of reach. In that moment, he realized something. He wasn't just losing his grip on reality. He was being pulled away from it. The hospital was pulling him deeper into its web. In a fit of desperation, Alex forced himself to stand, his knees weak and trembling beneath him. He stumbled to the door, trying to escape the claustrophobic suffocation of the room. But as his hand touched the cold metal handle, it felt as though an unseen force gripped him, holding him in place. His body jerked back involuntarily, and he collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. Panic surged through him as he realized the hospital wasn't merely a place. It was a force, an entity that had the power to manipulate not just the environment, but the very fabric of his mind. And he had become its unwilling prisoner. The nurses found him later, his body curled on the floor, trembling. They helped him to his feet, their expressions unreadable, and led him back to his room without a word. Alex didn't resist. He couldn't. It was as if his ability to fight back had been drained from him, like a battery running low. What had once been a spark of rebellion within him now felt like a distant memory. As they closed the door behind him, Alex slumped against the wall, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt as though he were drowning in an ocean of his own fear. But as the minutes ticked by, an unsettling thought began to form in the back of his mind. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It wasn't about escaping the hospital or finding a way to fight back. It was about facing the truth that he had been avoiding for so long. The figure from the other night appeared in his mind again, its words echoing in his ears. "You're not ready." Alex had believed at first that he wasn't ready to leave the hospital, that he hadn't yet completed whatever twisted trial it had set for him. But now he wondered if the truth was even darker. Perhaps the hospital had been right all along. Perhaps he wasn't ready to face what lay beyond its walls because he had become part of it. Its history, its structure, its essence. His very being had become entwined with the hospital's. And if that was true, then there was no escaping it. Not anymore. His fingers curled into fists as he sat in the center of the room, his mind racing. He could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above him, the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway outside. The oppressive quiet was suffocating. He thought of the other patients, the ones who had been here far longer than he had. Had they all gone through this? Had they all been broken by the same force, ground into submission until there was nothing left? Alex closed his eyes, and for the first time since he had arrived, he began to question everything. Not just about the hospital, but about himself. Who was he now? What had he become? And, most haunting of all, was he already lost? The truth was a slow burn, creeping up on him like a sickness. He couldn't outrun it. He couldn't hide from it. The only thing left to do was to accept it. And so, as he sat there in the dim, sterile room, the weight of the realization settled over him like a shroud. The hospital had broken him, but not in the way he had feared. It hadn't stolen his mind or his identity. No, it had revealed them, exposed them for what they truly were. And now, there was no turning back. The man who had walked into this place was no more. The only thing that remained was a hollow echo of who he had been, trapped in a place that was both his prison and his reflection. It wasn't until the following week that Alex truly began to understand the gravity of his situation. The disorienting episodes had intensified, and the atmosphere within the hospital had shifted from oppressive to outright suffocating. It was as if the walls themselves had closed in on him, their surfaces now slick with a tangible, oppressive tension. No longer were the staff the mere background players in this place. They seemed to take on an almost spectral quality. The nurses and doctors moved in and out of rooms with a dispassionate, mechanical precision, their expressions as empty as the faces of the other patients who seemed to have lost all will to speak, let alone resist. It wasn't the isolation that had affected Alex the most, though. It was the fact that the hospital had begun to feel familiar. Not in the way that one might grow accustomed to a place after some time, but in a more insidious sense. The hospital was no longer merely a building. It was becoming a reflection of his own fractured mind. The narrow hallways seemed to stretch out before him in endless loops, like a maze that had been designed to trap him. Doors that led to nowhere, staircases that climbed up to rooms that no longer existed. He had begun to lose track of time altogether. Days bled together, and it became impossible to tell where one ended and the next began. In his more lucid moments, Alex tried to fight it. He forced himself to focus on the details, to cling to the few things that hadn't shifted in the madness around him. The smell of antiseptic, the cold metal of the bed frame beneath him, the sound of the door clanging shut behind him. But these small details only served to remind him of how little control he had over his own life. Even his thoughts, once sharp and precise, had begun to unravel. They no longer followed a logical course. His mind had become a jumbled mess of fragmented memories and fleeting images, each one more disturbing than the last. It was during one of these fragmented episodes that he first saw her again, the woman from his first night in the hospital. She appeared in the hallway, walking just out of reach, her back to him, her white gown billowing behind her like a ghostly shroud. She had a grace to her movements that seemed unnatural, a kind of fluidity that bent time and space around her. Alex felt a shiver run down his spine as he watched her. But there was something else, too, something that he couldn't quite place. A sense of recognition, a feeling that he had known her long before this moment. But where? How? Before he could gather his thoughts enough to call out to her, the woman disappeared around a corner, her figure vanishing into the shadows. Alex stood frozen in place, a strange compulsion urging him to follow. His feet moved before his mind could register the action, propelling him forward despite the hesitation gnawing at his chest. It was as if some unseen force was guiding him, pulling him deeper into the labyrinth of the hospital. The walls seemed to close in tighter as he moved, the air growing heavier with each step. He turned the corner and found himself in a small, dimly lit corridor that he didn't recognize. The floor was covered in dust, the air thick with the smell of decay. There were no windows here, no signs of life. The hallway seemed abandoned, forgotten. Yet, at the far end, he saw the woman again, standing before a door, her back still to him. She didn't move when he approached, as though she hadn't noticed his presence at all. Alex's breath caught in his throat as he reached out to touch her shoulder, his fingers trembling. When he made contact, the woman's form jerked, as if startled by his touch. She turned to face him, and Alex was met with a sight that nearly made him stagger backward. Her face was blank, featureless, a smooth surface where her eyes and mouth should have been. Instead, there was only a dark void, a deep, empty well that seemed to draw him in. It was a grotesque sight, one that threatened to swallow him whole. He recoiled, stepping back, but the woman's hand shot out to grip his arm, her touch ice cold. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice a soft, haunting whisper that seemed to echo off the walls. "You're not ready. You're not supposed to see this." The words made no sense, but Alex felt the weight of them pressing down on him. He tried to pull away, but the woman's grip tightened, her fingers digging into his skin with unnatural strength. The hallway around them began to shift, the walls bending and warping as though the very foundation of the hospital were crumbling. The ground beneath his feet seemed to dissolve into a thick, black mist that rose up to swallow him. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The woman's grip disappeared, and Alex found himself standing in the middle of a different hallway, the one he recognized from his room. The woman was gone. The air was still. It was as though nothing had happened at all. Alex stumbled back to his room, his mind racing, trying to process what he had just experienced. Had it been a hallucination? A trick of his overworked mind? Or had something far darker taken place in that forgotten corridor? He couldn't be sure, but he knew one thing for certain. The hospital was changing him. Slowly, imperceptibly, it was molding him into something else. Something he didn't understand. Something he was terrified to become. That night, as he lay in his bed, staring up at the ceiling, Alex realized that the hospital wasn't just a place. It wasn't a physical structure or even an institution of medicine. It was a living, breathing entity, a creature that fed on fear, on confusion, on despair. And it was playing a game with him, slowly pushing him toward the breaking point. Every moment he spent within its walls, he felt himself slipping further away from the person he had once been. He thought back to the woman, her blank face, her cryptic words. "You're not supposed to see this." What was it that he wasn't supposed to see? And why did it feel as though the very act of seeking the truth was what had sealed his fate? Perhaps it wasn't just the hospital that had changed, but him as well. Perhaps he had been drawn into a world where there was no escaping the darkness. And now, the mask that had concealed the truth was slipping away, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the raw, unrelenting horror beneath. The following days were a blur. Each morning Alex woke up with the same weight pressing against his chest, the same oppressive sense of dread hanging in the air like a storm cloud that refused to move. The feeling that he was being watched never left him. It lingered in the shadows, in the corners of his vision, and in the strange, flickering lights that had begun to appear in the hallways. The walls, once cold and sterile, now seemed to have a pulse, a rhythmic, almost organic quality that made the whole building feel as if it were alive, breathing in sync with his own anxieties. Despite the increasingly surreal nature of his experience, Alex found it harder to distinguish between what was real and what was a product of his deteriorating mind. The moments when he questioned his own sanity had become more frequent, the lines between reality and hallucination blurring in a way that left him feeling helpless. Each day, his thoughts grew more fragmented, as if the pieces of his identity were falling away, one by one, until he was left with nothing but an empty shell. The woman he had seen in the hallway, the woman with the featureless face, had not reappeared, but her words echoed in his mind constantly. "You're not supposed to see this." He tried to tell himself that it was just a dream, a product of stress, or perhaps some side effect of the medication he had been given, but deep down he knew it was something more. The hospital was changing him. He could feel it in his bones, in the way his body no longer obeyed him. There were moments when he would reach for a glass of water, and his hand would tremble uncontrollably. Other times, he would find himself staring at a wall, completely immobilized, lost in thought, only to snap out of it hours later with no recollection of how he had gotten there. Even the staff had started to behave differently. They no longer seemed like ordinary doctors and nurses. Instead, they appeared almost mechanical, like actors playing roles in a show that had long since lost its meaning. Their eyes were cold, distant, and Alex could swear that some of them had seen things they weren't supposed to see. It was as though they, too, were trapped in the same twisted play that he was. It was becoming increasingly difficult to trust anyone. The words, "You're not ready," haunted him, and he began to wonder if he had missed something, if there was something darker lurking beneath the surface of the hospital that no one dared acknowledge. One morning, as Alex wandered through the halls, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, he saw Dr. Simmons, the head psychiatrist, standing at the end of the corridor, his back turned to Alex. For a moment, Alex hesitated, unsure if he should approach. The man had been one of the few people who seemed genuinely concerned for his well-being when he first arrived, but lately, even Dr. Simmons had started to seem off. His posture was rigid, his movements precise, as if every step had been carefully rehearsed. Alex walked up to him, but before he could say anything, Dr. Simmons turned abruptly, his face twisting into a strained smile. "Alex," he said, his voice smooth and calculated, "I was hoping we could talk." There was an odd glint in his eyes, something Alex couldn't quite place, something that sent a chill racing down his spine. "I don't know what's happening," Alex blurted out, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "Everything's different here. I don't understand what's going on. Why does it feel like the walls are closing in on me?" Dr. Simmons nodded slowly, as though he were weighing the right words to say. "It's not unusual to feel that way in a place like this," he said, his tone oddly detached. "The mind, when under stress, will often create a sense of disorientation. But you must understand, Alex, that sometimes the mind creates its own reality." He paused, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "The hospital is a reflection of you, of your inner turmoil." Alex felt a shudder run through him. "What do you mean by that? What do you know about me?" The psychiatrist smiled again, but this time it seemed colder, more calculated. "I know that you've been struggling, but perhaps what you don't realize is that the struggle isn't just against your own mind. It's against the truth, and you're not ready for it." His voice dropped to a whisper, as if he were sharing a secret. "Not yet." The words hung in the air, leaving Alex stunned. He wanted to protest, to demand answers, but a sinking feeling in his stomach told him that he already knew too much. The walls, the shifting corridors, the strange people, it all pointed to something far more sinister than he had ever imagined. He was not just a patient in a psychiatric hospital. He was part of something much larger, something that was slowly drawing him into its web. As Dr. Simmons turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, Alex felt the weight of the psychiatrist's words settle over him like a dark cloud. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was trapped, not just by the physical walls of the hospital, but by something much more insidious, something that had infiltrated his mind and was slowly unraveling everything he thought he knew about himself. Later that evening, as he lay in his bed, Alex found himself staring at the flickering light above him. His thoughts raced, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What was happening to him? What had he truly seen? The woman, Dr. Simmons, the strange corridors. It was all part of the same puzzle, but the pieces didn't fit. He wanted answers, but the more he searched for them, the more elusive they became. It was as if the truth were deliberately being hidden from him, and the harder he tried to grasp it, the further it slipped away. In his moments of desperation, he began to question whether he was losing his grip on reality. Or maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to see things that no one was supposed to see. And if that were the case, then he knew he was on the verge of discovering something that could shatter everything. Alex's pulse quickened as a realization washed over him. He was not ready for this truth. And yet, no matter how hard he tried to escape it, the truth was coming for him. The walls were closing in, and this time, there would be no way out. The following day, a strange stillness seemed to hang over the hospital. The usual hum of activity, the routine of doctors and nurses moving through the halls, was replaced by a quiet that felt almost unnatural. It was as though the entire institution had gone dormant, holding its breath, waiting for something. Alex could feel it in the air. The corridors were emptier than usual, and the whispers from the nurses, once hushed and inconsequential, now felt deliberate, intentional, even. Alex had spent the morning pacing the halls, trying to piece together the fragmented thoughts that had been swirling in his mind ever since Dr. Simmons' cryptic words. The hospital, his reality, everything seemed to be slipping through his fingers, like sand running through an open hand. He had tried to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks, but the longer he stayed, the more impossible it became to ignore the truth. If there was such a thing in a place like this, it was as if the entire hospital was an elaborate trap designed not just to contain him physically, but to manipulate his very perception of what was real. Alex had begun to feel a presence, something darker, something watching him. Every corner he turned, every shadow he passed, seemed to pulse with an energy that wasn't there before. He would catch glimpses of movement from the corner of his eye, only for the figure to vanish the moment he focused on it. There were sounds, low murmurs, hushed voices, and the flickering lights that had become a persistent nuisance now seemed to grow more erratic. The feeling that something was wrong had reached a crescendo, but no one else seemed to notice. Everyone else moved with purpose, focused on their own routines, seemingly oblivious to the strange atmosphere that suffocated the hospital. Dr. Simmons' warning, "You're not ready for the truth," echoed in his mind as Alex sat in the waiting area, staring at the faded upholstery and the half-empty coffee cup in front of him. He couldn't stop thinking about those words, trying to decipher them, trying to grasp whatever it was he was missing. What truth? What did the psychiatrist meant? The hospital? The patients? Was it all connected? And if so, how? His mind raced, the walls of his thoughts narrowing with each unanswered question. It was then, as if on cue, that the power went out. The whole building plunged into darkness. The hum of the fluorescent lights silenced in an instant. Alex froze, his heart thundering in his chest. The silence that followed was suffocating, oppressive. The kind of silence that only deepened the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he tried to turn on the flashlight. But even that failed. The phone, once reliable, now sat dead in his hand, a useless object in the face of this new, paralyzing reality. A voice, low and guttural, broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here." Alex whipped around, searching the room for the source of the voice. But no one was there. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he could feel the temperature drop, the cold pressing against him from every direction. It wasn't just the darkness that chilled him. It was the way the shadows seemed to stretch, twisting in unnatural ways. His heart pounded louder now, each beat like a drum in his ears. "You will see," the voice said again, its tone more insistent this time, as if it were right beside him. Alex's breath caught in his throat, and his mind screamed for him to leave, to get out, but his body remained frozen. The room felt smaller, closing in on him. He could feel the walls pressing in, the air growing thick, suffocating. The voice wasn't just in his head. It was real, tangible, an entity that existed in this space, in the very air he breathed. There was no escape. The lights flickered back on abruptly, and for a brief moment, everything seemed normal. The hospital had returned to its usual state, sterile, clinical, and lifeless. But that was the thing about this place, Alex realized. Nothing was ever truly as it seemed. Even when it looked normal, even when everything felt like it should, there was always something lurking beneath the surface, waiting to emerge. In that moment, Alex understood. The truth that Dr. Simmons had hinted at was not a metaphor. It wasn't something abstract or psychological. It was something more concrete, something far darker and more horrifying than he had ever imagined. He was not simply a patient in a psychiatric hospital. He was part of something else, something much larger and far more dangerous. This place, this institution, was not just a place of healing, as they had told him. It was a place of containment, a place where the truth was hidden, buried deep beneath layers of deception. Alex's pulse quickened as he stood, his legs unsteady beneath him. The fear, once an abstract feeling, was now visceral, choking him with each breath. His mind raced, pulling together the pieces he had gathered over the past days. The strange occurrences, the cryptic messages, the cold, mechanical behavior of the staff. And it became clear. The truth wasn't something waiting to be discovered. The truth had always been here, buried in plain sight, woven into the very fabric of the hospital. He had become part of this twisted system, a piece of the puzzle that could not be undone. The walls had been built to keep people like him, people who had begun to see too much, trapped, isolated from the world outside. They had been conditioned to think that they were the ones who were broken. But in reality, the institution itself was the fracture. The twisted nature of the hospital was not just psychological. It was physical, rooted in every brick and every piece of equipment. It was a system designed to keep its inmates from ever finding the truth. And Alex, it seemed, had been foolish enough to start looking. And now there would be no going back. The doors were locked, the windows barred, and the very foundation of the hospital had become part of the madness. The truth, he realized, was not something that could be solved. It was something that would consume him, and everyone who walked through those halls, until there was nothing left but the broken, fractured minds that inhabited it. It was too late to escape. The fracture had already begun, and it would not be mended. Not now, not ever. As the days wore on, the hospital seemed to grow quieter, more oppressive. Alex could no longer distinguish between the real world and the world his mind had created. The lines between what was happening inside the hospital and what was happening in his own fractured psyche had blurred to the point of being indistinguishable. The corridors, once familiar, now felt like mazes, twists and turns that led him back to the same rooms, the same faces, the same haunting echoes of a past he could no longer remember. Alex had spent the past few weeks trying to make sense of everything, but the more he uncovered, the less he understood. Dr. Simmons' words, "You're not ready for the truth," haunted him like a shadow that wouldn't leave. And now, as he sat in his room once more, the walls closing in, he felt the weight of those words pressing against him. The revelation that had eluded him for so long was finally within his reach. But at what cost? In the dim light of his room, Alex began to piece together what had been scattered before him. The faces of the staff, The routines that had seemed so normal in the beginning, the strange occurrences that had followed him. Each of them were linked, connected by a thread he had failed to see until now. He wasn't just a patient in a psychiatric hospital. He was part of a larger experiment, a controlled environment designed to break him, to strip away the remnants of his identity and force him into a new mold, a new understanding of reality. It wasn't just the hospital. It wasn't just the patients. Alex realized that everything he had known, everything he had believed, was a construct, a carefully crafted illusion. The truth that had eluded him for so long was not a revelation about his past, not some hidden trauma or repressed memory. It was the realization that his entire life had been manipulated, engineered for the purposes of this institution. The people around him weren't patients, nor were they doctors and nurses. They were all part of the same system, the same design, a cog in a machine that operated beyond his understanding. The real horror was not the mental breakdown he had assumed would come. It wasn't the isolation, the strange behavior of the staff, or the inexplicable events that had shaken his confidence. The true terror lay in the realization that he was not a victim of his mind, not a victim of the hospital's treatments, but a victim of a far greater force, a system that controlled everything. The hospital was not just a place for the mentally ill. It was a place for those who had been chosen, those who had been selected to participate in a long-standing experiment, a project that aimed to break down human consciousness itself. Alex's breathing quickened as the enormity of this truth sank in. The system was not just one hospital. It was a network, an intricate web of institutions designed to isolate and reprogram minds, to create a population of people who would accept the manipulation of their own perception. The patients, the doctors, the staff, they were all actors in a play whose true purpose was never revealed to them. A purpose that was only visible to those at the top, to those who controlled the narrative from behind the scenes. In that moment, Alex understood that the struggle he had faced, the questions he had asked, had all been part of the system's design. The twists and turns, the flickering lights, the mysterious voices. It was all engineered to keep him off balance, to make him doubt his own mind. The hospital was not just a physical space. It was a representation of his own fractured consciousness, a place where reality itself had been manipulated to the point of distortion. There was no escape from this place, not in the way he had hoped, not in the way he had imagined. The doors, the windows, the staff, they were all just part of the illusion. The truth, the final, terrifying truth, was that Alex had never truly left the hospital. The life he thought he had led outside, the memories he had clung to, all of it was fabricated, a mere construct of the system that had shaped him. He had been a patient before he even entered the hospital. The life he had lived was simply another phase of the experiment, another chapter in the ongoing manipulation of his mind. The realization came crashing down upon him like a tidal wave. He had spent his entire existence trying to escape something that was never real. There was no real world outside of the hospital, no outside to return to. He had always been here, always been part of the system. The other patients, the staff, even the nurses, they were not merely part of the experiment. They were the experiment itself, reflections of his own fractured mind, manifestations of the very manipulation that had controlled his life from the start. Alex's mind reeled as he tried to grasp the full weight of this truth. But there was no comfort to be found, no solace in understanding. The truth had never been something to be sought. It had always been there, buried deep within the core of the hospital, buried deep within him. The walls had always been there, and he had always been trapped within them. The horror was not in what was happening to him now, but in the realization that it had been happening all along. The system had succeeded in breaking him, in remaking him into something else, something that no longer resembled the person he had once been. And so, as Alex sat alone in his room, surrounded by the sterile walls of the hospital that had once seemed like a place of hope, he realized that there was no escape. Not anymore. Not ever. He had become part of the very system that had sought to control him, part of the machinery that had been grinding away at his identity for so long. There was no truth beyond this place. There was only the system, the fracture, the endless cycle of manipulation that had no end. As the lights flickered once more, Alex understood that the real horror was not in the external world, but in the fractured, distorted world within. And now, he was just another patient, just another mind that had been shaped, molded, and ultimately broken by the very institution that had promised to heal him. In the end, Alex realized that the revelation wasn't an escape. It was the final step in his transformation. The truth was not liberating. It was the last chain that bound him forever to the hospital, to the system, to the experiment. And as the darkness closed in around him, he finally understood that the true horror was not the loss of his mind, but the fact that he had never truly had one to begin with.